So I am very excited to talk about preprints because I think they can have a lot of benefits both for science and also for your career. There's been a lot of benefits for my own career, so this is why I love sharing this with other people and other researchers as well. So, and it's also better for society too. So better for society, better for science, and better for your career. In terms of society, most people can't access research. I think as researchers at a well-financed institution who have access to almost every single journal, we can forget that a lot of people don't have access to research. A lot of scientists, but a lot of the public don't have access to research. And there's a lot of differences between fields, but no matter how you look at it, most of the research or a lot of the research that we're doing today can't actually be accessed by the public. And this is actually a human right that any sort of benefits that we have from science should be accessible by the public as well. So we have almost an ethical obligation to be able to do this, and preprints can help solve this problem. One of the common hesitations when it comes to this, or one of the reasons that a lot of people will like, I don't care that much whether the public can access my research, is that the public don't care. But I don't think that's correct. There are so many instances of situations where scientific discoveries have been shared online and the public have been really, really excited. There was a great example a couple of years ago of the first image of the first black hole, and this got a lot of interest online from a lot of lay people. So the public is a lot more interested in science in science than we actually think. And this idea that, well, we shouldn't really bother about making sure our research is publicly accessible because the public don't care, I think that's a bit of a stretch. We also need to break down a lot of these stereotypes. A lot of people think scientists are very out of touch. It's something that we do behind closed doors, but by actually having our research out there, this is very important. This is especially important for us that are doing clinical research. There are a lot of people and a lot of people's families who are very interested in staying up to date. And we might not think, oh, they have the expertise, but people are very, very motivated to learn a lot about their the disorders that they've been diagnosed with, but also the disorders that their family members or their friends might have. And by having research that is open access, they can actually access that. There's so many stories of people who are very surprised when they find out that the research that they're paying for because they're taxpayers, they can't actually access. They hit a paywall and they're asked to pay a lot of money just to access a paper, and they email the authors to ask to access to the paper. And of course, us as authors send this to the people who are interested. But our research, especially our clinical research, should be accessible to the public, can read and understand what research is out there. And when we lose public support, we're at risk of losing funding. Here in Norway, in the past couple of weeks, there's been a lot of turmoil around the funding situation of the Research Council of Norway. And the reality is, if the public is interested in science and interested in scientific research, and there's any threats of scientific cuts, we decide who's in government. So the public needs to be interested in this. But if we're not actually giving the public what they're essentially paying for, then we're at risk of losing funding when it comes to the research that we're doing. And that's not good news for us, for our jobs. So it's better for society, but it's also better for your research career. It's a bit of a selfish benefit, but it's true. Preprints and open access is much better for your research career. Now, a preprint is essentially a complete scientific manuscript which is submitted to a public server. This isn't a new idea. This has been around since the 70s, since almost the dawn of the internet, pioneered by maths and physics, but recently it's gotten a lot more popular within the psychological and within the medical sciences, especially with COVID. It's gotten a lot more popular to share your work as a preprint. So before I go into it, I want to share a story of a paper. This is one of my first preprint experiences that happened a couple of years ago. With this paper, it was talking about Bayesian statistics, but the content doesn't matter. But essentially what had happened with this particular paper was that I had an idea. I started picking up and learning this tool, and I shared this online. First as a blog post, and got a lot of great feedback, and I thought, this is great. I think there's a lot of interest in this. So rather than actually going and submitting this as a paper, the first thing that I did was, well, I'm not like 100% confident. I'm not, because this is a new technique. Maybe I'm saying something that's incorrect, or maybe I can improve this paper. So I posted this as a preprint, and by doing this, I got a lot of valuable feedback on this paper. What had happened was, for this particular paper, the second author wasn't the original second author. The original second author actually left for industry, which is fine, which happens, and he didn't have the time to continue working with the paper. But this second author was actually one of the people that came across the preprint online and had a lot of great comments. And I asked him, why don't you join as an author? And he ended up doing that. So it can get a lot of benefits in terms of finding collaborations, but in terms of also getting feedback as well. Now, I could have submitted this paper and I could have, won the peer review lottery and could have gotten through without actually noticing some of the stuff that I said that was slightly incorrect, and it would have been published. And it's very difficult to change errors in the scientific literature in terms of corrections. But by posting this as a preprint, errors were found, and the paper was much improved. And typically, if this was a normal paper, unless the peer reviewers were on their game, they wouldn't have picked this up. So by having this as a preprint, I was able to get early feedback on my work. Because when you post it, quite a lot of people have set up email alerts. I think it's important to remember, a lot of people have Google Scholar alerts, for instance, and Google Scholar indexes the major preprint servers. So if you have a search alert, cognitive function in schizophrenia, in Google Scholar, for instance, anything that's posted as a preprint will actually come up. So people will find your preprints. Exactly the same thing if you're searching on Google Scholar, for instance. Preprints come up, and it's a really big benefit. And another really big benefit with preprints in Google Scholar is if you have a paywalled article and Google Scholar also detects you have a preprint of that article, it will actually give you a link so you can get direct access to the article. So it helps you get around paywalls. And articles that get around paywalls are more cited, and more citations is better for your career, as we all know. So we have this process for this particular process where this presentation or this work was shared on Twitter, which led to a preprint, which got some more feedback, which led to a new author and led to a publication. So it was very useful. Another thing that actually happened was it became very handy when it comes to actually submitting your work to journals. Editors obviously want to know that there's interest in your work. So one thing which some people do is in their cover letters, a lot of journals actually ask you to note that this has been submitted as preprint, which is totally fine. But it's also useful to say, hey, this has been submitted as a preprint, and it's already got 1,000 downloads, for instance. So the editor can actually see before the paper's even been submitted for review that there's already interest in the paper. It provides an early marker of impact. We know that it can take years and years for citations to accrue for papers because of the whole process. But with preprints that are submitted immediately, you can begin to get that feedback almost straight away. Open access or papers that are pre-printed get increased citations. Most of us, when we're submitting our job applications or grant applications, we have to mention the number of citations that we have. Whether we like it or not, citations are important. And most grant agencies or most for most employment opportunities, they'll use Google Scholar, or they don't say not to use Google Scholar. Google Scholar does a cool thing in that you can actually combine the citations for a preprint and for a paper. So if you've submitted a paper and it's been under review for 2 years, if that paper is a preprint, it can already begin accruing citations. And once your paper gets accepted, then on Google Scholar, those citations actually get combined. So instead of having 0 citations for a paper, by the time it gets published, you might have 5 citations. And then as soon as your published work, or as soon as your peer-reviewed work starts getting cited, then you can combine those citations. So any paper that is openly accessible gives you an academic advantage because you can get more citations, and that's very useful. Back to this idea of getting feedback. The Facebook has been iterated thousands of times. This is what Facebook used to look like when it was the Facebook. But even still to this day, Facebook is running hundreds of experiments simultaneously. They're tweaking and getting constant feedback on how they can improve their product and how they can keep your eyes glued to their screen more so they can sell you more advertising. We can do the same sort of thing. Well, the normal way of getting feedback in academia is extremely slow. You get this idea for a paper, you submit a rec application, you write it to the journal. If you're lucky, you get a revision, but chances are it'll get rejected. And this whole process takes a really long time. compared that to Facebook or to other online products where you can get feedback almost immediately. You try something and people can tell you via their feedback whether there's any interest there. By doing preprint submission, not only can you get fast feedback on your work, but it also gives you priority of discovery. One big concern that we have as researchers is this idea that I've got this fantastic idea, but I think there are other people like in Sweden who are working on the same sort of problem. What if they publish their paper before us and our paper becomes less novel? With preprints, you can get your priority of ideas. So you work on your paper, and rather than crossing your fingers that your paper is going to get accepted and published before other people can have something similar, with a preprint you can do it immediately. So you actually get around this idea of you can get around these gatekeepers. Maybe you have a really new idea that a lot of people, a lot of big names in the field don't like, and you're potentially going against the grain a bit. Your papers can get rejected if they happen to be peer reviewing or if they're friends with the editor. But with a preprint, you can get your work out there immediately and get feedback. You can get around the gatekeeping that comes with peer review. This is especially important for PhD students or people applying for PhDs or applying for postdocs. Here's a great example from Dorothy Bishop that sometimes people can write in their CDs, well, I have 2 papers under review, but what does that mean? Those papers can be high quality, they can be low quality, you have no idea. Whereas when you're submitting for grant applications or for jobs, and this is especially important if you're an early career researcher and you only have a few publications, which is fine because that's your stage of the career. That's your stage of your career. You can actually say, okay, I have 2 papers under review, and here are the preprints. So people who are on committees can actually go and read your papers and don't have to guess the quality of your paper, and you can immediately provide that sort of information for people who are assessing your applications. So there's a lot of differences with the traditional way of doing research versus open access or preprinting. So traditionally, you'd have to sort of go through, your press office, but with emerging ways of doing preprints and doing open access, you can inform the public by yourself. It's also a really good way of getting immediate feedback on your work. So traditionally, what would happen in the past, you have a paper that you're working on and you have these results, and you would go to a conference and typically you'd be presenting work which might be under review. But that can take time. There's only a few conferences that you can go to a year. Some people might not have the opportunity to travel for various reasons. But now with preprints, you're actually able to share your work and get that feedback. It almost fills the gap for what happens in conferences. Preprints were great during COVID lockdowns because there were no conferences, so people weren't able to get feedback on their work. Whereas preprints can fill that gap. And again, there's huge differences with publishing. You can have to wait years and years with the traditional system to get feedback, but with preprints, you can publish your work and get feedback almost immediately. Some common objections to preprints is that people think, well, if I preprint my paper, somebody can see that and they can take ideas from that preprint and then they can publish them. But the thing is, preprints provide scoop protection, and because preprints provide a public record and a timestamp record of when your work was submitted, stealing a preprint in that way is the dumbest crime because it's open for everyone to see. Everyone can see, and it's open and documented, everyone can see that idea was taken from that particular preprint because it was published beforehand. So this actually gives you scoop protection. A lot of people are just hesitant because they're like, well, I just don't know how to do it. But we're scientists, we have to learn new skills all the time. And the way that preprint servers are set up now is it's very straightforward to post a preprint. If your preprint is ready and formatted as a PDF, it can take as little as 5 minutes to upload your preprint. You just have to add a bit of information, such as copying and pasting your abstract and including your authors. But it can take a very little amount of time to actually post your preprint. Another concern, which was borne out a little bit more within COVID, was that scientists will rush out poor quality research. But physics has been doing preprints for a very, very long time, and this problem hasn't been borne out in physics. And at the same time, peer-reviewed work also is not a guarantee of quality as well. So we can't rely on that completely. But the most important thing is that preprints are public and transparent, so anyone can evaluate the quality of work that you're doing there. Our current system, the way that the publications are going right now reflects an older system and an older way of doing things. But with preprints, we've got a new opportunity of actually upending the publication system and how we do things now in terms of how people get access to your work and how feedback can be given almost immediately. In terms of preprint server options, there's a number of different places that you can go to, but at least within psychology and medicine, some popular options are Open Science Framework. Now, if you're not really too sure, I would go with Open Science Framework. The benefit with Open Science Framework is this is a platform where you can host the entire life cycle of your research. Perhaps you have a protocol for your trial that you're running. Perhaps you have an analysis script for for your paper. All these things can be posted on an Open Science Framework project page. Everything can be linked together, including a preprint. It's also a very easy process for uploading a preprint as well. And there is no, they only have post-submission moderation. Other preprint servers, such as bioRxiv, go through a moderation check. So it can take 24 to 48 hours for someone to read it. Basically, anything that you're doing will be fine. This is to stop against, there's a lot of spam that gets posted in bioRxiv that gets stopped. Pseudoscience type stuff, people who claim to have, wacky stuff. But anyway, Open Science Framework only has post-submission moderation. So if you want your work to be immediately posted, I would go with Open Science Framework. And the interface is quite easy, and it's also easy to update your preprint as well. And that's the other thing as well. You can update your preprint. So the amount of times that I've posted a preprint and I'm like, oh gee, I found a typo. It's very easy to update your preprint. And simply it'll just say in your preprint, this is version 3 of the preprint, and any interested reader can actually go back and read prior versions as well. It's very transparent that way. So don't think that the preprint that you post is the final version. You can update it. Another example of that is you submit your paper to a journal, it gets rejected, but you get some great feedback. Before you submit it to the next journal, you can update your preprint based on the feedback you got, change your preprint, and then resubmit. It's totally fine to update. It's not just this immutable object. You can update your preprint. So yeah, PsycArchive is another great option if your work is very much oriented towards the psychological sciences. It uses the same platform as Open Science Framework. The one possible benefit with PsycArchive is that a lot of people have set up alerts. So any new paper in PsycArchive that's been published, they'll get alerts. So if your work is very much oriented there, I would also recommend PsycArchive as well. Another benefit of PsycArchive is a number of APA journals have a direct submission access option. So I think there's 10 journals now. You submit your work to PsycArchive, and then with a click, you can submit your work immediately to a number of different journals. I believe Open Access Framework has a similar deal. I know bioRxiv has a similar deal with a number of journals as well, in which you can submit your work there, and rather than going through the entire process of formatting your work and going through all the forms, with a few clicks, you can submit your work directly to journals from preprint servers, which I think is a fantastic idea. Research Square is a relatively new preprint server. This is interesting because it is heavily linked with Springer Nature journals. So if you submit your work to a Springer Nature journal now, they'll actually give the option of, hey, we can submit this automatically on your behalf to Research Square preprint server. So this is interesting. So this is a good opportunity, and this is a great way to sort of get into preprints only if you're submitting to a Research Square journal. And what's really handy is you have the option of actually saying on the preprint, here's a preprint. This paper is currently under review in translational psychiatry. So people can actually say, oh, cool, this paper's under review in a nice journal. That's great. So those, I think there is a few more options out there, but these are the most popular options, at least for the work that we're doing in the biomedical sciences. But if you have no idea and you're like, I don't know what to do, I would start with Open Science Framework because there's a lot of documentation out there on how to do it, and it's very user-friendly, and there are lots of ways that you can integrate the other parts of your work that you're doing in terms of protocols and in terms of analysis scripts and all that kind of stuff. It's very, very handy, and I use Open Science Framework. I think most of my papers I do myself there. Some of my papers I do PsycArchive, and in the past I've used bioRxiv as well, but I just like the integration that Open Science Framework actually provides. So yeah, that's it. If you want to learn more, here is a fantastic resource, ASAP Bio, where you can learn more about preprints. The other thing I want to say is within our area of research, within the biomedical sciences, there are very, very few, if any, journals now that do not accept papers that have been pre-printed. Especially with COVID, basically every single journal within our area do accept papers that have been pre-printed. Of course, if you're not sure, you can go and check the journal policies, but just check the journal policies, Control F, search for preprint. But I haven't come across one recently that I'm not to say that none doesn't exist, but I haven't come across one recently. And at least the major journals within our field, it doesn't happen. All these journals accept preprints. Some of them say, note in the cover letter that this has been pre-printed, but this is not going to bias the editor's decision. If anything, it's going to help the editor's decision because it means they can see whether a particular paper's got initial feedback. But if you want to learn more about preprints, I would check out ASAP Bio. Really good, but basically answers all the questions that people frequently ask about preprints. So yeah, very happy to do some Q&A, but thanks all for your attention.